The West is hypocritical about, fighting for freedom and democracy. It claims to be doing so in places like Ukraine. But the truth is that for decades, the West has partnered with dictatorships around the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America. And dictatorships are very convenient for Western interests because they don't need to negotiate with the parliament. They can just negotiate with one person, whoever's the head of, the dictator, and they strike a deal with them, and whatever they need, they get. And I think Kagame is unique in this because of the scale of the crimes, the alleged crimes, and the crimes for which there's credible evidence against him, and the respect and adulation that he receives in the West. I think he's quite unique. I can't remember another dictator who has covered up crimes of this magnitude and received this level of adulation, to the extent that, he's, as I write in the piece, that he's invited to Harvard and Yale to speak about human rights. It's absurd and surreal.
Very, very, very scary.
And so, many the dictators have faced similar declines in support. Mobutu, Habyarimana, so many of them were friends. Yeah, were friends, and then they suddenly were not friends. And then their power declined, and all the forces that had gathered against them suddenly became too much for their regimes to bear. So I think it's even though Kagame says he's standing up to the West, to me he's really a puppet of the West. And that as you say, 70% of his budget is financed by the West. Without Western support, his government could not retain power in Rwanda.
Not at all.
Yeah. Come out of Rwanda. They give Kagame some money or millions of dollars and say, we want people to wash their hands for hygiene or whatever, or wear slippers. And people do. And then you can measure those results. And then the aid industry goes and tells the world, look, our programs are working. What they don't say is that their programs are working because of dictatorship. And this is not sustainable. People are complying with these instructions because they're afraid of the consequences. Not because they understand that this will, help their families. Maybe a small percentage do it for that reason, but a large percentage do it because they're because they're afraid. And this atmosphere of fear in Rwanda is very useful for Kagame. It's useful for the aid industry. And so they've formed a partnership, unsavory, corrupt, I believe, partnership to promote aid programs in Rwanda and get Kagame. Kagame gets the money he wants. The aid industry gets the results that they want to show off to the world. And that's unfortunate. Rwandan people are caught in the middle where the fear and the dictatorship is useful to everybody. And so in whose interest is it to end the fear, to break the dictatorship? It's not useful for many interests. And programs like mine to train Rwandan journalists, in reporting the abuses of power, holding Kagame accountable, these become inconvenient for Kagame and for the aid industry as well. With the suppression of all the opposition candidates, people have been found almost beheaded. The Green Party vice president, other opposition candidates are in jail, Gabire. Others have been smeared, like Diane, I believe, had her photos, nude photos, doctored photos circulated to smear her and tarnish her reputation in very misogynist ways. How can there be a fair and free election? It's just the conditions are not even there. And I don't think Kagame even pretends, maybe officially he says it, but he's boasted before the election that he's going to win. And, it's a show of force. The election becomes a show of force more than a democratic exercise. And no country in the world does anyone get nearly 99% of the vote.
Even Museveni doesn't get there. Uganda.
No, and I found this is something that I found even in Rwanda when I was there. It's like a country of 100%. Everything has to be 100%. Reconciliation rates have to be 100%. Hand washing rates, everything has to be 100%. And there's pressure on all the local officials to make it 100%. And it's a bit absurd. And it's funny, in the same talk in Oslo, the Oslo talk that I gave, I mentioned that I met a Russian UN officer who had grown up in the Soviet Union. And he just arrived in Rwanda, and I asked him, what do you think of Rwanda? And he said, it's just like the Soviet Union. I opened the newspaper and there's only good news.
That was one of my questions down. That was one of the things I was about to mention, because I think I know where the bad news the title of the book came from.
Exactly. It's like, where is the bad news? Everything has to be 100%. It has to be only good news. There can't be bad news. If it's bad news, it's some small technocratic thing. Some official somewhere didn't, do his job to the degree that he should, so that there's even more control. But is it bad news about the government abusing its power? Never. That won't be reported, because the government is only good, and Kagame can only be good. He only can be a hero, and that's the narrative. And anybody who challenges that, as you said, their lives are in danger. And so that's the tragedy of Rwanda. And anyway.
Yes, I want you to say something. I mean, to talk about this behavior of the West, giving the OIF, the Francophonie, a Rwandan candidate, and also Kagame to be the chair of CHOGM, which is really the core values of these organizations are justice, rule of law, democracy, and free press. What can you say about that?
You can't trust it on these questions. It defends democracy when it's useful for it, I think the West rightfully has been criticized for the role it played in the genocide in Rwanda. France was supporting the Habyarimana's government, Operation Turquoise. The West was financing Habyarimana's government even when it was implementing racist, genocidal policies. So this is nothing new. And I think the thing to expose here, as the title of my article did, the online title was, he's a brutal dictator, but one of the West's best friends, is just to expose that hypocrisy and say, the West has never really defended human rights and free speech, even though it pays lip service, and sometimes it does in these organizations like CHOGM and OIF, that they're supposed to defend these values. But the truth is that military interests, economic interests, geopolitical interests often take precedence over these values. And even though it's good that we all fight for democratic values, I think, and by the way, I should say that it's not just you and me who defend it. You living in the United States and me coming from India, defending these values. Ordinary Rwandans and Rwandan journalists, Rwandan activists, human rights defenders, politicians, even the former Speaker of Parliament, Joseph Sebarenzi, all of them, all these people who have fled Rwanda or been in prison or been killed, all of them living in Rwanda have fought for these democratic values. So sometimes there's a narrative that, democracy is not for Africa, or it's, Africans don't want democracy, they want a strong man. It's not true. All the people who fought for that have been exiled or giving speeches in the U.S. instead of working to build a democratic system within Rwanda. Even taking into account Rwanda's history, they wanted these values because they understand, they've lived outside, they understand how it can benefit Rwandan people, how it can lead to a more stable society in which future violence is less likely, future ethnic violence, future violence against Kagame, which Kagame is so afraid of. That's why he arrested and imprisoned Paul Rusesabagina, why he tried to assassinate Nyamwasa, why he assassinated Karegeya. All these questions, he's worried about violence, but he's created the conditions by which nobody can challenge him peacefully. And that's what many Rwandans tried to build. And Kagame just said, no, he concentrated power entirely in himself. And he's built a system where if you want to challenge Kagame, the only option now for many people is to think about military action. Because anybody who tried peacefully, he shut them down. He's imprisoned them or had them killed. So, what do Rwandans do? He blames, he calls these challengers terrorists. But in reality, he's created the conditions by which that's the only way in which people see an opportunity to challenge him. And that's the tragedy that Rwandans are now living under today. And they don't deserve this. Ordinary Rwandans do not deserve to live in a country where peaceful transition of power is nearly impossible. And Kagame has made that impossible. And so that's the tragedy, that violence can happen again, and that Kagame has created these conditions for it to.
Definitely, we fear it's going to happen again. I hope it doesn't.
I think the truth is out there. The truth will come out. It's very clear that people will read, and the Kagame will be held accountable at some point. And as you say, it's not for us to decide what's a genocide or not. It's for a competent court. That's who should decide whether Kagame's killings were acts of genocide. Certainly, the evidence on the face of it looks credible and convincing, and it's not just from one source. It's not just the UN investigators. There's been Gerard Prunier, and in his book he mentioned it, and UN officials back in 1997 also mentioned 200,000 Hutus killed by Kagame's forces, possibly acts of genocide again. So it's been a narrative throughout the ages, and I think it's just a testament. Again, we come back to the Western hypocrisy. My point there is that Kagame has created these conditions where if he loses power, there's going to be great violence, and that's his creation. He had a choice to work with all the Rwandan politicians whom you mentioned, former Minister of Defense, former UN ambassador, former Speaker of Parliament. He had the opportunity to work with them to create, to some degree, a more democratic government where power is shared. But he chose not to do that. And I think he's responsible. If there is violence in Rwanda today or tomorrow, and you've mentioned your own personal fears about that, if there is violence, Kagame will be responsible. And that's something that, we need to emphasize. And I believe the fact that, my article going on the front page, I think, is a recognition among many people who didn't want to believe, these allegations about Kagame. I think the narrative is turning. I think the editors of the New York Times chose to put that on the front page speaks to two things. One, that the narrative is turning. People are beginning to recognize Kagame's crimes. And B, the second thing is that in the past, a lot of reporters have not spoken about those crimes. So there's been this gap. It's a surprise to many people. And that's why it went up on the front page. It's news, even though it shouldn't be news. The UN mapping report is sitting on shelves since 2010, and it should not be news, but to many people it is news because of the poor reporting, because of Kagame's allies, because of so many people trying to lift Kagame up and trying to portray him as some kind of benevolent visionary, when actually, he's a dictator, and many of the problems that all dictators create, he is creating. The principal one is that, there's a risk of violence. And my question is, how come somebody like Kizito Mihigo, who is an orphan of the genocide survivor, the face of the genocide commemorations for so many years in Rwanda, how come it's not reopening wounds when the Rwandan government says that he strangled himself to death in a police cell in Kigali? And where's Stephanie when that happens? Is that not reopening wounds? And how can she claim that moral authority to speak on behalf of genocide survivors in Rwanda when Rwandan genocide survivors have been systematically killed and robbed of their voice? The whole genocide experience and narrative is so central to Kagame's power that they don't have any voice anymore, and in some cases don't have their lives anymore. And so, I just see this as Stephanie doing her job. She's a government spokesperson. I do my job. She does her job. It's all okay. But I don't take her comments very seriously. I don't take the Rwandan government's comments very seriously on these questions. They don't have any moral authority after going after so many and killing so many genocide survivors. And another point, which I didn't cite it in my article, but I indirectly cited it, is that Kagame, during the genocide, the RPF told the UN not to send peacekeepers 1 month into the genocide. And there's this famous letter that, again, people who believe Kagame's story ignore. There's this famous letter the RPF sent in 1 month into the genocide, said the genocide's almost over. The genocide continued for 2 more months. They said the genocide's almost over, there's nobody left to save. And Alison Deforge, at the time, she criticized Kagame and the RPF for that. She said countless Tutsi lives would have been saved had they allowed UN peacekeepers into Rwanda. And so again, Kagame, where's the moral authority to speak on behalf of the Tutsi survivors of the genocide when Kagame himself actively promoted policies that led to the deaths of countless Tutsis? And it's not just me saying this, it's a respected Alison Deforge from Human Rights Watch. I just don't take, I think Kagame is just, that's why I think the concept of Ubwenge is so useful. He's doing his job. He's getting as much power as he can. But the fact that these narratives now are on the front page of the New York Times, I think speaks to a change in the narrative about Kagame. It also, also another important thing is Kagame tried to brand Paul Rusesabagina as a terrorist. Now, Paul Rusesabagina is now living as a free man in the U.S., a country which is allergic to anybody, even close to a terrorist, being free. And so I think the U.S. government is very aware about the deceptions, the lies that Kagame's government spun around Paul Rusesabagina. And they're waking up. I think more people in government are waking up to the fact that a lot of Kagame's discourses and claims are false. And so slowly his fortress is crumbling.
In your conclusion of the article, you did conclude saying that at the very least, Western leaders, beginning in Britain, should do something simple and stop rewarding authoritarians like Mr. Kagame. And that is my first question. It is whether whether you think that is going to happen, and also why Britain? Why Britain?
Oh, it was just Britain because
Britain in this one.
Because I mentioned in that piece that the Kagame's greatest coup was the refugee deal with the UK to send asylum seekers from the UK to Rwanda, which is absurd because you're sending people fleeing dictatorships and violence to another dictatorship and violent place. But that was a coup, and so my point was that Britain should cancel that refugee asylum deal and stop endorsing Kagame in this way, in this very public way. Do I think it's going to happen? I think, personally, I don't believe dictatorships are a sustainable form of government, especially in Kagame's form of dictatorship, where he concentrates power in himself and people close to him. And you've mentioned the long list of people who are in exile, who've been killed. If you don't share power, you become very vulnerable. And so I think, it's inevitable, sadly, that dictatorship at some point folds, like every other dictatorship in history, and that will be accompanied by violence. Whether the West, what the West will do, I think, is just, geopolitics. They're just going to decide whether Rwanda, when Mobutu used to be the West's big partner in Central Africa, the CIA listening station, all the aid programs used to go to Zaire or to, what's now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And when Mobutu fell, all that aid and support shifted to Rwanda. Mm-hmm. And who's to say who the next, friend of the West is going to be, who the next dictator who is a friend to the West is going to be? It's hard to predict these things. What I think is easier to predict is that dictatorships do fall, and they create enemies, and at some point the forces against them become too great to bear. And so I think with time, with chipping away at Kagame's reputation, I think this is inevitable. And the real question is, how do you try to do that so that it doesn't lead to another dictatorship coming into power? That it leads to all these good people who wanted Mr. Berenzi and others who wanted a more democratic government. How can they play a greater role in Rwanda to build a fairer, more equal, more participatory government in which Rwandans don't have to fear another round of violence just because a leader loses power? I think that's tragic. A personal fate of a leader should not be tied to the fates of or the security of people in that country, in any country, and in Rwanda especially. So I think that is a big question, and many foreign governments are maybe grappling with that. How, even if they don't want to support Kagame, how do they do that in a way, now that he's built this dictatorship, how do they pull out support in a way that doesn't trigger more violence? So that's a tricky question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. And I think Kagame is going to benefit from that for a while. But at some point the forces are going to align against him, unfortunately, for the Rwandan people, and we'll have to see what happens then.
I appreciate that, and this deal is becoming more and more unpopular, even in the UK. Hopefully, they will come to learn that this is not good for Britain, for refugees, for migrants, and now for Rwandans as well. And then
exactly in Rwanda today, the journalists who are trying to work in an honest and truthful way, the government says they're bad, so the news is bad. And so really my book is an homage to all the brave Rwandan reporters who gave their lives for freedom or country, because many of them are in exile and not happy because they would like to live in Rwanda. All these things to fight, to try and report on Kagame, to fight for freedom, to fight for truth, to hold power accountable, to protect, to try and protect and help the Rwandan people. They gave up so much, and their names cannot be spoken in Rwanda today because Kagame has said they're enemies of the state. And so my book is really an homage to them, and to this idea that, Rwandans are traumatized by the genocide. Some people say the Rwandans are traumatized by the genocide. They don't protest. They don't want to rock the boat because they're happy with Kagame. It's not true. Many Rwandans gave up their lives and freedom to challenge Kagame and paid for it. And in the appendix of my book, I list some 70 journalists Rwandan journalists who were disappeared, imprisoned, attacked, fled the country, or were killed after they criticized Kagame. And I think their brave work needs to be recognized, remembered, documented. And it's incredible for me that even today, this year we had John Twali, who was killed in a suspicious road accident after criticizing Kagame. It's incredible for me that there are brave Rwandans who step up, even after all these journalists have been harassed. They still step up and they challenge Kagame, knowing the risks. And really, my book is a tribute to them. I learned so much about journalism working alongside these Rwandan journalists. And the little I could do was to write a book about their stories and, give back in some way.
That is, it's a very important book that tells the story about Rwandan journalism and free expression. But I'm sharing in an image. It says, this is I think it was 2023. I got this from RSF website. And it says Rwanda score. I don't know how they calculate the score. I don't even know what this means, the 46.58. But it's ranked 138. There are a number of, I don't know how they come to this conclusion, but they do say that journalists killed, that is in a different, they don't mention exactly the journalists that are being killed in January. They don't say, they say there is nobody. But you will agree with me that there is not really independent journalism in Rwanda. So how do they really reconcile? There's no journalism in Rwanda, there's no free press in Rwanda, but yet it is, how do they come to these statistics?
Yeah, I think, there's a lack of local context. The fact that there's no journalists or fewer journalists killed in Rwanda today is because so many were killed in the past that very few people dare to do any kind of journalism today. And so how do you quantify that, the climate of fear?
Right.
It's not that people are stupid and journalists are stupid, and if 5 people are killed last year, that they're going to go and continue to do their reporting. They're humans with families and children and parents, and they're going to protect themselves and they're going to keep quiet. And I think in those terms, Rwanda is one of the most tightly controlled countries in the world today. It's almost totalitarian, the level of control that the government has, Kagame has, over speech in the country. And so, yeah, I think you have to take these rankings and ratings with a grain of salt. The other thing I think is difficult is, outside Rwanda, it's hard to know what's happening unless you have very good sources with family and close contacts. And so I always take these rankings with a bit of salt. They're trying to do their best. They're saying Rwanda is a dictatorship. There's very little free speech, that journalists are being attacked. I think that's the main message that you have to take away from these reports. That a free press is essential to building a stable country, and Rwandans don't have that today. So where does Rwanda go from here? How can the world? How can journalists like myself? How can Rwandan journalists? How can international actors? People, Rwandan diaspora and exile. All of us who have some connection with Rwanda in some way, care about the country, care about the people, want to see a Rwanda where there's no violence in the future. How can that be constructed and built? That's the question that all of us have to ask ourselves. And these reports are just building blocks, proof points along the way. The fact is, Kagame is so supported by the West. Whatever happens in Rwanda, the West, I believe, was complicit and has a responsibility to bear for the genocide in 1994. And the West has now a responsibility to bear in the state Rwanda finds itself in today and whatever happens tomorrow. And so we need to pressure the West and hold the West accountable as much as we hold Kagame accountable, because they're partnering. They've partnered in very close ways to build Kagame's reputation and prevent him from being held accountable for his crimes.
And the John, you mentioned John Williams, and there is in this on this website, Reporters Without Borders, they mentioned the fact that they have 85 organizations asked for independent investigation. 85 organizations, but yet Rwanda find the driver. Nobody saw him. No one saw this driver. No one saw anything. So we don't even know. It would be wrong to say maybe it was an accident. Nobody saw anything regarding that accident. Nothing. Not a crash report. Nothing. And the government fined the driver. So isn't it an admission of guilt? Because they don't want anything. They don't want publicity. They don't want this thing to be known.
Yeah, and I remember it reminds me of when John Leonard Muhumbaje was killed in 2010. In the morning he criticized Kagame, in the evening he was shot dead. And the government, Rwandan government produced some two people who said that they killed him for some personal dispute. For me, these acts are a show of force. The Rwandan government is showing Rwandan society and the world that they can kill with impunity. They can lie about who killed the journalist, make up some false story, and nothing happens. And that's a show of power. It shows that every Rwandan's life is in the hands of the government. The government can do whatever it wants with them, imprison them, make them disappear, kill them, and nobody will ask questions. Nothing will happen to the Rwandan government. The Rwandan government will not lose money, will not lose its reputation, will not lose military alliances with the West. That's what's shocking. There are no consequences from the West, and that's why the West is, complicit in what's happening in Rwanda today. And I think that's tragic. And that's why I think it's relevant to put these kinds of stories on the front pages of newspapers like the New York Times. And I think it's very telling, because the New York Times is a very establishment newspaper. It's, for them to criticize the West in this post-colonial narrative on their front page is a very rare thing. And, personally, I think it's a culmination for myself. I've been writing about Rwanda for 10 years now, and it's taken 10 years for this to end up on the front page, for it to be, millions of people to read this and understand this, for the narrative to shift. I really think that with Paul Rusesabagina, with my piece, with, other journalists who've written books and, articles, with Kagame recently saying that the West should not criticize if Rwanda partners with Russia, I think these are all signs that, the alliances that Kagame has traditionally had are slowly coming apart. And, the question, as I said, is how can this happen in a peaceful way?
It's very troubling, because they're clapping, and he's telling them that he used the limited resources that we Rwandans we need in the Central African Republic, and also we don't know what is in the national interest of this country. But do you see that the government, that is like the parliament, is also another branch of the presidency? So
of course. Yes, exactly. So, there's no parliamentary power in Rwanda today. And it's interesting. I think it's interesting. You need to unpack it further, maybe in another conversation, but about how Rwanda feels that its limited resources are usefully deployed to change or hold regime in another country, to hold up a government or, prop up a government in another country. What is Rwanda's interest in this? I suspect there's some economic, military, intelligence interest. The Central African Republic has a lot of diamonds and gold. Russia is there currently with the Wagner Group. Maybe Rwanda's profiting as it profits in Congo, in Eastern Congo. So that would be a model that could be repeated in the Central African Republic. Who knows? I think it's very interesting, these questions that you're raising. Thank you so much for having me.
I appreciate your time. Thank you so very much. I was truly honored to have you, and I'm sure the audience agrees. So we see you next time.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to come back, and thank you to everybody for listening and watching. Thank you.
I appreciate
All right.
it. Thank you.
Thanks, Nafal.
Thank you, Jack.